Oh, this is where Don Jones used to keep his spare key. Of course, everybody knew where it was. Don's old place. Where am I going?
Scene 25, take 1.
I came to downtown Los Angeles because a friend of mine from high school moved downtown, and he knew I was doing terrible in school. I hated where I was at. I was at Texas A&M, and it turned out to be a huge Bubba factory where I did not belong. He told me, well, if worse comes to worse and you flunk out of college, you can always come live with me downtown. It's interesting, and I was looking to get as far away from home as possible. So eventually I did flunk out my senior year, and I took him up on his offer. I lived at first on San Pedro Street, a few blocks over at the 443 building, and I was introduced to that, what I call the gritty beauty of downtown. It's what we're all attracted to. It's why we all live down here, and that gritty beauty that exists here and really nowhere else in LA. And so I eventually stayed. That was May 1984. After I had lived at that 443 building for a few months, I started hearing about, well, you should go to Al's Bar, and it has this crazy hotel upstairs, and you'll learn all about it as you live in the neighborhood. You can't live downtown at that time and not have eventually discovered Al's Bar and the American Hotel. There was an inevitability. You couldn't come downtown and not at least have some memory of the airplane. If there was one thing that stuck in your mind, it was that there was a building with an airplane stuck on the side of it. The 443 building felt a little bit dislocated from the rest of the art scene. So after about a year, I eventually decided to get a single room over here in the American Hotel. I moved over here primarily because of economics. The rent back then, if I recall, it was about $350 a month for a single unit. Some people had been here for years and they were grandfathered in at a lower rate. People didn't move into the American Hotel because of its top-notch facilities and its accoutrements. It was bare bones, but most of the people that lived down here, that's why they lived here. It was actually part of the attraction. You got your exercise every day. It was long flights of stairs. That was essentially part of the charm. Life in the American Hotel was similar to dorm life. There were a lot of open doors. You could wander up and down the hall and see who was in and who wasn't. It was a very social scene. There were some people that moved in and had a little more than their backpack and a mattress. And they had a very Spartan existence in the American Hotel. There were other people that turned their room into like a little box set with furnishings, and I was probably more in the second camp. I had a big queen-size brass bed, and I had a sofa and a formal dresser, but my place, I actually ended up packing it so much that by the end, I just had a narrow alley where I could get in. I was definitely a pack rat with lots of furniture. One of the most important parts of the hotel experience had to be that Al's Bar was the living room and dining room combined for the whole community. It was where everybody could meet everybody else. There was no other nexus. To be even more precise, it was the pool table. People met at or around that pool table that was there for years and years. If you had to identify one focus for the entire community, I would say it was the pool table, more than the bar itself. I was drunk a lot of the time, like everybody was back then. But the first beer I probably bought was from Don Jones when he was unofficially a bartender for a short while. I remember Tara, of course. Tara was your typical broad with a heart of gold, spark plug, the kind of energy that you loved but didn't want to cross. I remember Stacy, the skinny sweetheart that probably brought in more business than any other bartender they ever had, just based on her personal draw. I wasn't like a lot of people who came to Al's Bar. I wasn't a punk rocker. I didn't even really follow the local music scene at all. So I would hear years later about some famous band that played in Al's Bar, and people would say, oh, do you remember seeing so-and-so? And I'd say, I probably saw them, but I was more interested in trying to check out the girls and see if somebody could loan me enough money to get another beer at the bar. But the acts came and went, and they just went right over my head. Other people came for the music. I came for the camaraderie. It's possible I was rubbing elbows with a whole bunch of people and I just was too oblivious to notice. The people in this hotel were a particular slice of the whole community. For want of a better term, you'd call them the bottom feeders, but they did resemble the community at large in that this was always a community of outcasts, misfits, social fringers. It's almost as if the arts district is like on a low point, and everybody else in LA who isn't too deeply tied down to where they're at would eventually find their way to the arts district. George Zarvis, crazy old man George. He was the dangest creature. He was like somebody who stepped out of a time machine from the 1930s. The guy wore a little 30s hat. He was the kind of guy who used to say things, oh yeah, now you're riding the trolley. He'd talk like a character from an old Depression era movie would. You would run into him in the hall, always late at night when he was mopping, and always in the loudest possible way, slapping that mop against every door. Whap, 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 whap. He always used pine saw like 100 times more powerful than you needed to. So if the noise didn't wake you up, the odor certainly would. There's a long list of people I met here, but some of the more interesting characters that have stayed with me, are people I haven't seen in years and years. I remember one fellow in particular, Jack Poet. He was the most debauched and disgusting human I've ever met. He's not somebody you would want as a friend, but I remember even still being so struck with how degenerate this guy was. He was a guy who would take all of his money and blow it gambling. He used to tell me the most disgusting stories about the prostitute he picked up the week before and crack whores, and I didn't have anything in my experience to prep me for meeting somebody who was this foul-minded. He was a regular in Al's bar, but this is like 85, 86. But I've always wondered what happened to this thoroughly debauched creature. I wonder if he was killed in an alley, or he's got to be out there somewhere. By about spring 1985, I moved into my room in the American Hotel on the 4th floor, looking downtown. I remember the night I was to finally occupy my place. The room had been repainted, the floor was repainted, the walls were white, it had been scrubbed and cleaned, and a lot of my friends downstairs in Al's bar, they heard how I was moving in. And so after the bar closed, an after-hour party was struck up in my room. People started coming in with beers and booze, and before I knew it, there were 24 people having a completely spontaneous housewarming party for me. But the next morning when I woke up, curled up on the floor in my empty room, there was broken glass, there were blood stains, I think there was a puddle of piss in the corner. The floor had been used like an ashtray, so it was covered with burnt joints and cigarette butts everywhere. And the room was completely trashed before I even moved the first article into my brand new room. Yeah, good times. When I lived downtown and I was living at the hotel, back then I was making money working for different garment manufacturers. But of course, living in the American Hotel around all kinds of creative people, you want to do something more than just pay rent, whether it's just helping out with an art fair or becoming involved with a friend's art show somehow. And the way I got involved was the steam show. Brad Goldstone did these steam shows. They were amazing. Now, I didn't have access to a metal shop or the equipment that some of the other participant artists did, but I remember there was a steam show where I wanted to submit a piece, and although I didn't have any experience at it, I decided I wanted to use copper piping and try to make a steam-powered calliope. I had to really fight to figure out how to use a torch and how to make my own steam organ pipes, but I was able to get kind of a half-assed contraption. It didn't work very well, but I could claim it worked successfully enough. I thought that was a blast, being part of a show. It wasn't for any money. It wasn't a piece I sold. The show that year was in that empty parking lot that's just south of the hotel. I remember that space looking so unusual. When you walked in, there was no lighting except for all these wood fires, but also the steam and the smoke hovering over the whole performance space gave a kind of ghostly quality to that whole show. Another art-related thing I got involved with was Al's National Theater. Al's National Theater was done right there in the central room of Al's Bar, right there on the stage, the same stage that had all the musical acts. I knew nothing about acting or theater, but occasionally I would be down in the bar and they'd be doing a theater piece in the room next door and they'd say, "Oh, we need somebody who can do the door." So I'd start out doing that, and I'd watch the play, and then I'd volunteer to come back and do it again the next weekend, and I'd volunteer to do a little more. Some days the lighting guy couldn't come in. There is one play so out there. It was this post-apocalyptic play. The first half featured these two humans, like the two characters in Waiting for Godot, wandering across this desolate landscape where everybody has died. And then in Act 2, those two characters are replaced by a family of vultures, and you had a bunch of actors that were in vulture costumes, and they were discussing their future and how they were suffering from famine because there were fewer and fewer corpses. The play got bleaker and bleaker as it went on. Finally, in the third act, one of the human protagonists, he finally just decides to kill himself, and he hangs himself on stage. One day, this apparatus that the actor used to hang himself, the post started falling down and it fell over with him still attached on stage, and it could have been a bad accident. Fortunately, the actor wasn't hurt, but he had to go with it. That gave me my first taste of working in theater and that form of public entertainment, but that kind of came back later for me. The Cirque du Soleil came to Los Angeles in 1987. They'd never been to the United States of America before. Before then, they'd been a small regional circus that had barely left their home province of Quebec. But they were seen by some patron of the arts. She really prevailed on the committee to get the Cirque du Soleil to come down and participate in that year's Los Angeles Arts Festival. The first U.S. city the Cirque du Soleil ever played was just a block over and a block up from here, at 2nd and Alameda. When they came to town, they made a huge splash. I started hearing from all the neighbors, "Oh, have you seen this circus? Oh, they're wonderful. You have to go see them." But at the time, I was between jobs, and I didn't have the disposable income for a circus ticket. So I was afraid they were going to come and go, and I would never see what everybody was raving about. The cast and crew and other members of the Cirque du Soleil had been coming into Al's Bar during their free time. It was the closest watering hole for them when they had their off hours. There were a number of performers who came over here because this was a place where they could get drugs. And it was so comfortable and democratic. They started hanging out. There were parties on the roof with performers doing their act. Eric and Emily were on the roof doing their hand balancing act, sometimes on the parapet wall, without a net. But one day this fella came in with his Cirque du Soleil tour jacket, and he was next to me at the bar, and he struck up some small talk with me, and he asked me finally confidentially, he says, "Do you think you can tell me where a guy can get a joint around here?" And I said, "You want to get high? Well, no problem, come with me." And I just went right out on the back patio, and I reached in my shirt pocket, and I pulled out my bag of weed, and I twisted up a big fatty. We just smoked a joint right out at the patio. And he said, "Did you come see our circus yet? I'm the backstage manager, and if you come around tomorrow night, I can comp you in to see the show." Well, he didn't just give me a free comp seat and then walk away. He took me for an entire backstage tour, and the seat I had wasn't even in the regular audience. I sat backstage, so not only did I have an eagle's eye view of the show itself, but I stood next to the artists as they were limbering and preparing for their acts, going out and doing their acts. And after they came off stage, my first experience seeing the Cirque du Soleil was mind-blowing. I was watching the whole show from the inside out, the kind of ticket that you couldn't purchase. The Cirque du Soleil took me away from the American Hotel in October 1987. This backstage manager told me that if I wanted to work for the Cirque du Soleil, they were leaving the next day and he could make sure I got on his work crew. And by now, I was enthusiastic, so I worked like a devil on my friend's crew. And at the end of the teardown, he says, if you come down to San Diego, I can guarantee you're going to get on the crew again because you work really hard. I came home that day and began packing everything in my room in the American Hotel and put all my possessions in storage. Then I got a friend to drive me down to San Diego. So I ran away with the circus for the next 3.5 years. Then I eventually settled for another 3.5 years in their hometown of Montreal, Canada. I worked at their headquarters preparing sets, decor, readying the material for new shows. Eventually, I found myself looking around saying, why am I staying in Canada? The economy is a lot better in Los Angeles. I decided to come back to L.A. and see what my Cirque du Soleil reference might do for me, looking for work in, say, Hollywood, where that reference might mean something. Turns out it did.
Cut.